2020 is the 60th anniversary of the death of Boris Pasternak, probably one of the most significant Russian writers of the 20th century. The publication in 1958 of Dr. Zhivago, for which he won the Nobel Prize, was also a significant moment in Russian history as well as European history, global history. Dr. Zhivago was probably one of the most significant novels published in the 20th century, and the themes it deals with, although played out on a very large canvas, the lead up to the Russian Revolution, the unfolding of the Russian Revolution, and then the consolidation of it, is part of the epic novel Dr. Zhivago. Dr. Zhivago, two films have been brought out on it, the 1965 version, which most people know, and then a recent version of it came out in 2003. Dr. Zhivago, the novel, obviously you can't put something that thick and layered and full in a movie or a film, and so these two films in their different ways take elements of Zhivago and do their best to give the people watching it a real sense of the dynamic quality, the insights of it. But what I want to look at today, though, is the novel Dr. Zhivago and its relevance for today. So Dr. Zhivago then and now. As I mentioned earlier, obviously the novel is played out on a large canvas of the ideologies at work in terms of what was going on in Russia, the drift and direction from Tsarist Russia, the critique of the oppressive nature of Tsarist Russia between the aristocrats, the emerging middle class, and the peasants and the working class, and the injustices which were very much a part of that period of Russian history. And Pasternak describes that in graphic and raw detail in Dr. Zhivago itself. I want to look at a couple of the major actors, actresses in Dr. Zhivago to look at, in one sense, their perennial significance for our time in the culture wars and the clashes, and look at certain types, personalities, how people respond to suffering, people who are in the midst of suffering and they long for justice, the different directions they can go, what happens to people who can't buy into any of the ideologies, either the conservative right, the moderate liberals, or the revolutionary left. What happens to people who see the good in all of those but are not convinced of any of them in the midst of culture wars? In particular, in the midst of culture wars, you're either with the tribe or you're not with the tribe. If you're not, you're a compromiser, you're a Judas. Or if you're with the tribe and you begin to ask questions about it, you're often rejected from the clan. And so there's this form of herdism often at work in culture wars. Now, as I mentioned earlier, what Pasternak is doing in Dr. Zhivago, he's looking at the tragic consequences of a situation within a state where injustice has been part of the particular, what people have lived with. For some, others have lived on the plenty and the wealth of a country, and that is coming to an end. Tolstoy had anticipated it, he predicted it. He died in 1910, the revolution occurs in 1917, but there were all sorts of events leading up to that a person had their eye on the turbulence and what was coming, and the bigger tidal wave, they would have anticipated what happened. But let me just take a few of the leading actors on this particular drama. And as I said, it's a drama played out on a large epic scale, but the principles of it, most of us wouldn't live with the actual carnage of it, but the principles of it across time, which makes Dr. Zhivago an epic work. So the first, I'll look at Pasha Antipov, who became Strelnikov. Pasha begins in a working class family in a poor area of Moscow. He knows suffering, he knows injustice. He has a sweet personality, what William Blake would call songs of innocence. As he emerges in his life and he becomes much more aware of the real social conditions he's living with, his family is living with, the class he's living with, he becomes sensitized increasingly to the injustices of the time. He's also very, very much drawn to, attracted to Larissa, or Laura, one of the, probably the leading actress of the novel itself. And as the novel unfolds, Pasha goes on to get education. In his education in sciences and humanities, he becomes acutely aware of class analysis. He becomes acutely aware of injustice, the disproportion between wealth and poverty, working class people. And that sweet innocent side then greets the songs of experience. So his experience begins to tell him now that something has to be done. And he has participated in a variety of protests in Moscow and has watched the Cossacks come and beat people down, particularly the protesters. People are killed, blood on the streets, the snow layered with blood. And he's aware of what happens when you dare to challenge power, particularly when power is reinforcing justice, and the military is a part of that. His relationship with Laura grows, and he only discovers as he's moving on that Laura, as a young girl, was taken advantage of by Komorowski, a wheedling sort of a person who only thinks of his own desires and the gratification of his desires, a lawyer who's done very well in life by abusing. He's a calculating person who's very narcissistic, and people exist to serve his immediate ends, wants, and needs. He knows how to play society. He knows how to play vulnerable people, of which Laura's mother is one of them. He happens to pay for her. She's not doing well in her shop, and so he assists her, but then of course they have this relationship in which he can cast her off when she is no use, and he moves on to other women in the process. And one evening, of course, Laura becomes his plaything, and as a result of that, as Pasha moves along, it's revealed to him clearly after he and Laura grow deeper in the relationship of Komorowski's taking advantage of him. And so you've got in Pasha someone who's experienced immense injustice. The woman he loves has been taken advantage of. As a result of this, anger, bitterness, vindictiveness, revenge begins to grow in his soul. The concern with injustice is legitimate, but in terms of the toxins getting into his soul, they intensify, they grow, and he begins to climb up the ladder of the revolutionaries, and he becomes known then as Strelnikov, one of the most hated and feared men in terms of those who would oppose him. He begins to lose who he actually was, Pasha, the innocent, the sweet person, as he encounters injustice, brutality, and then he becomes the very thing he opposes, as one of the most deadly revolutionaries who will go into villages and burn whole villages because they're not with him and on the same page as him in overcoming the old order. And so in Pasha turns Strelnikov, you see someone losing their humanity, losing their innocence as they experience the injustice of time at a personal level, at a political level, at a military level, at an economic level. Interesting enough, when he ceases to serve the interests of the powerful, they then begin to hunt him down, and he becomes discarded. And as he begins to raise questions about what he has done, and he wants to return to the innocent Pasha, he realizes his life then is limited at a certain point. And so in Pasha turns Strelnikov, Strelnikov returning to Pasha, you get the story of someone who begins innocent, the suffering of life, the longing for justice, but in the process what he becomes is an angry, bitter, revolutionary person that takes advantage of others. He loses his humanity, so you get a clash between ideology and humanity. And in ideology, people are expected to goose step to the agenda, to the ideological issues, to the hot button issues in the culture wars. And if you differ or raise questions in any way, a person is marginalized, rejected. And this is what, near the end of Strelnikov's life, an interesting, touching meeting in Uriatin, and then Varakino, the estate, he meets with Zhivago. And so this is one tendency when a person, the danger when a person who sees suffering, struggle, What do they do with it? What happens when bitterness gets into their heart? They join groups that they think are going to be agents of justice, bringing injustice from injustice. What's the price a person pays in their heart? What's the price they pay for saluting before a laundry list of agendas? And what happens when you differ with that? What happens when questions are asked, when doubt comes in? Then you're rejected yet once again. So Strelnikov is a key figure in this. The flip side, in one sense, and I mentioned earlier, Komarovsky, he's just the sort of person that he's calculating. He uses people to serve his end. No principles whatsoever. Strelnikov had principles, the principle of justice, but certainly not a peaceful approach to embodying justice. So he's the sort of person that's very concerned with principle, justice, what's right, but the price he pays for being just leads to great injustice, not only to his soul, but to others. Strelnikov is the opposite, no principles whatsoever. He merely thinks of what's his advantage and what's going to give him immediate gratification or wealth or roles in society. Very calculating, conniving. Of course, there are many Komarovskys in life as well. Now, Zhivago is someone who came from a difficult family background. His mother dies young. His father was a bit of a rake. Interestingly enough, Komarovsky was his lawyer and was there when he committed suicide. Zhivago was adopted into the Gromyko family, and he grows up in a much more sheltered environment, a much more protected environment, in a much more wealthier area of Moscow. He goes on to become a medical student. But he's a doubting Thomas temperamentally. He's the sort of person that can see the good in all positions, whether it was the importance of a czarist tradition, but the blind spots of that. At least they brought order and predictability, but there was injustice, which is a part of that. He could also see the need for critiquing that, rebelling against it, why the working class had to rise up, why the proletariat had to act as well. But he also saw the violence that they were engaged in bringing about the revolutionary change. And so he idealistically was drawn to the ends, but again and again he questioned the means that they used. And of course, those on the left were as much divided as those on the right. So you have a multiplicity of intellectual interpretations going on in Dr. Zhivago. And the question is, well, who do you align yourself with in terms of things, not only thought, but also indeed? Zhivago is the sort of person that he sees the good in everything, which then leads to paralysis. Interesting enough, the first poem in the collection of poems at the end of Dr. Zhivago is Hamlet. And Boris Pasternak himself was a great translator into Russian of some of the great works of European and world literature. The one that he was very well known for is Hamlet itself. And Shakespeare's Hamlet is someone who is constantly finding reasons not to act or seeing alternate ways of dealing with his father's murder by the person who married his mother. And so Dr. Zhivago, in the novel Zhivago, is the person who constantly can see alternate ways, what we would call hermeneutical generosity today. But the dilemma of that, he's in a position that he cannot be committed to anything, and he becomes a passive person in the midst of the multiple challenges that come his way in life. And so he, whether it's clash between Tonya, who he marries, and then he gets drawn into Larissa or Laura, the broader issues. He's what today we would call a porous personality, a variety of perspectives to go through him, but what holds, he's liquid in that sense. And so what Pasternak is doing in Dr. Zhivago, he's essentially saying, look at what happens to a person like this over the long haul. So at the end of his life, Zhivago is in a third relationship. He's angry, he's a bitter person. Life has not worked out the way he had hoped it would. But some of the reasons for that is the porous personality, which has led him to many ways be paralyzed and not being active in meaningfully making decision and ordering desires so they go in a certain direction. He becomes the victim of his own desires, the victim of circumstances, the victim of relationships, and the victim of a lack of inner discerning center in the midst of what T.S. Eliot called the still point in the moving world. So Zhivago is the other side. If you can see Strelnikov and Komarovsky as what Charles Taylor would call buffered personalities, truly committed to something. For Komarovsky, it's just his sheer ego. To Strelnikov, to his sense of what's important and just. Zhivago, on the other hand, is someone of the porous personality type. He allows all of life to get in him, but then he has no personality in any center in any way. In the last years of his life, he becomes a paralyzed figure as he looks back over his life and asks himself, and so what meaningful decisions did I actually make, rather than being the passive victim of a multiplicity of possibilities in my own soul and in life, and then living with the remorse of that at the end. Laura is obviously a key figure in this novel also. Initially, she's abused, a damaged young woman because of Komarovsky. She could become bitter like Strelnikov. She had the option of going the Strelnikov route, not Strelnikov, the Komarovsky route, because of one, Komarovsky took advantage of his mother, and then he took advantage of her as a young woman. She marries Pasha. Again, he gets up and leaves her because of the vision he had of changing Russia. So again and again, she's rejected, she's abused, she's marginalized as a person, but the life force in her is a very creative life force, and she will not allow pain and suffering to make her angry or bitter, and she carries on in that sense. Some would argue allegorically, she's Mother Russia, ever renewing herself through suffering, through revolution, through pain. And then, of course, her meeting with Dr. Zhivago, he's drawn to her because he sees an innocence, he sees a purity in the midst of suffering, because he had suffered. His father committed suicide, his mother died young. He knew suffering. She had known suffering. And the question is, what does a person do in the midst of injustices? Suffering, do they become bitter? Do they become angry? Do they join a group in which their anger and poisons are reinforced in the name of justice? Or do they transcend that sort of ethical tribalism of the right or left? And so Laura really becomes, in that sense, the person who maintains a spirit of innocence in the midst of tragedy and pain and suffering. One thing about Pasternak and the poetry, and I'll leave here, there's many other things I could say, like, for example, Zhivago's half-brother Yevgraf was, even though in the Communist Party, he never lost his humanness, and whenever human sense of what it meant to be human, and compassion and mercy and kindness, and whenever Zhivago, it looked like they were moving in on him to kill him, Yevgraf would appear and step in and save his brother, and his brother never could quite understand what was happening behind the scenes. But Yevgraf is almost like divine grace, constantly appearing out of nowhere to protect Laura and Zhivago. One of the poems, there's a series of poems at the end of Dr. Zhivago, but one which is very interesting, and I'll just conclude with this, is that there's a tendency, particularly in a form of literature in life, it's called comedic, is that the human journey is such that we all encounter, Greek literature, it's called the agon, the struggle. Challenges come our way. They can be difficult challenges, they can be lesser challenges, they can be issues of injustice, they can be issues of struggles at home, painful experiences of life. But within the comedic tradition, whether they're issues we create for ourselves or what Heidegger would say, our thrownness, the comedic literature, following sort of, or probably more popular version of it, Walt Disney, you have the struggle and then you overcome the struggle and the ending is happy. So for example, a great deal of Walt Disney stories, there's the agon, there's the struggle, or a variety of struggles, and it ends happy. You get Lord of the Rings, many struggles, it ends in a positive way. You've got Star Wars, multiple struggles, it ends positively. Chronicles of Narnia, it ends positively. Harry Potter, it's a formula. It's a formula, but is life like that? Is life only comedic post-Agon? Now, and so we have a variety of fairy tales like that, of course, and what Boris Pasternak does in one of them, he looks at the fairy tale of St. George and the Dragon. And of course, that's a very famous story as well as Russia as well for the military. But the fairy tale most of them be aware of St. George of the Dragon is St. George is a knight concerned with peace and justice. The dragon is the dragon of evil, of injustice. And so the story goes, there's various versions, but one is the dragon takes the fair damsel, steals her from the village, or the village gives the fair damsel to protect them from being destroyed by the dragon. But the knight goes out, St. George does battle with the dragon, kills the dragon, and then saves the woman. And again, so the fairy tale end, life goes on happily ever after. What Pasternak does with that fairy tale, and this brings in the tragic dimension of life, of which certainly Dr. Zhivago is very much about, which doesn't end necessarily with a comedic ending, and in that sense you've got the comedic tragic element in Dr. Zhivago, is St. George goes out. He confronts, he senses the breath of the dragon is coiled around the maiden, and he realizes that his task eventually is to confront the dragon and defeat the dragon, save the maiden. But what in fact happens, he goes at the dragon, he falls off his horse, the horse kills the dragon, the horse is killed, the dragon is killed, and the fair maiden and George lie down, and the question is, do they die also? And so this fairy tale ends not in necessarily a happy ending as St. George and the Dragon, but all of them either die or the ending is ambiguous in that sense. How does it end? So there is this, what both Dr. Zhivago in the bigger sense as a novel, and what Boris Pasternak would have lived with in his own experience, was the Russian Revolution. You can be just, you can be trying to do the good. Does that mean that there will be a comedic end? And does that mean because a person tries to do what is right, Harry Potter, the best of the Jedi, in any of these stories, that it's going to turn out positive? Well, Dr. Zhivago and the fairy tale, or the rewritten or the revisionist view of the fairy tale by Boris Pasternak, points out just because a person's trying to do that which is good does not mean it's going to be a happy ending. It could be a tragic ending. It may not end well. And what Pasternak does in Zhivago and in the fairy tale looks at there is this tension between tragedy and comedy, and only naive people actually believe that life is comedic in terms of its ongoing journey. Anyone who lives outside of a hothouse of Western affluent bubble will realize that many stories do not end well, and some of the best people do not necessarily have happy endings. And so even in the Christian tradition, to some degree, it gives the comedic ending. Christ dies, Christ resurrects. So you get what Tolkien calls a eucatastrophe. But that's not the experience of many people in the midst of the struggle. They don't resurrect. It's not always a happy ending. So with the fairy tales, and of course many of the other poems, at the end of Zhivago, you get this, if it be possible to let this cup pass from me. The first poem, and I'll end with this, which is Hamlet in Dr. Zhivago. The final line ends this way, is, the journey of life is not as easy as crossing a field. It's a Russian proverb. And so and of course much of Dr. Zhivago is the crossing the field of life. And is it as easy, particularly when there's bombs in all places and ideologues are fighting as a person goes from when they're born to when they die, they cross the field of life. Is it as simple as crossing a field when there's landmines in all directions? And in culture wars, people take different positions. They turn on one another rhetorically. Obviously in Russia, they turned on one another militarily. They killed one another. There's various ways of killing people, of course, from a literal to a metaphorical. But the journey of life across the field is not an easy one, and that essentially is what Pasternak and Dr. Zhivago is about, and also the fairy tale St. George and the Dragon.